Bird flu, or avian influenza to be correct, has recently arrived in New Zealand. So far, it's only been confirmed in 2 cases involving 2 wild birds. But it got me thinking about the whole bird flu thing. So being me, I dug into the science and tried to find first-hand accounts from actual backyard chicken keepers. This video is about what I found, or more to the point, what I didn't find about bird flu. This is not a video about how to protect your flock from bird flu. That information is really easily available online, and basically it just boils down to make sure no wild birds can come in contact with your chickens, which is basically impossible, at least for me, but for most backyard chicken keepers, that is going to be a very difficult thing to do. And in my case, this is New Zealand, the land of the birds. Whilst my chickens don't have any direct contact with wild ducks or seagulls, they do have direct contact with pukekos, and pukekos like to hang out with ducks, so it's just gonna happen at some point. There's no real way for me to keep them away from all possible risk, and the sparrows are everywhere, and the sparrows hang out with whatever other birds they please, so it's just not that realistic. I'm not going to lock my whole flock up in a shed, which I don't actually have. They're not gonna like that, and I'm not gonna like that, and it's just not a realistic option. What I wanted to find out was what was the actual real-world risk to my flock if they happened to get exposed to bird flu. And I started to look at it, and the first thing that came up when I started looking for actual information is that bird flu has a 100% mortality rate in chickens, and that is a terrifying number to hear. But also, I was like, no viruses that I'm aware of have a 100% mortality rate. That is nuts. Even Ebola does not have a mortality rate of 100%. So I wasn't buying it. I wanted to find out where that 100% mortality figure was coming from. So what I found was that, yes, under certain conditions, that 100% mortality rate is correct. But this is from a lab situation to determine a very specific classification for different pathogens. And bird flu is classified as highly pathogenic. And how they got that figure is it fits into all of these very specific things. But basically, what they do is they inject the virus directly into the bloodstream of lab chickens. And if between 6 and 8 out of 8 chickens dies from this happening, then it is highly pathogenic and gets that high mortality rate percentage that I saw. But the way this is done, first of all, they injected the virus directly into the bloodstream of these chickens. That is not how virus exposure happens in the real world. The flu doesn't get injected into your bloodstream. You are exposed to it generally through your nasal passages, and it's through your body has lots of defenses before it gets to your bloodstream in the first place. So first of all, that's like, I don't know about that. The second thing is the kinds of chickens and the situation they were in that were having this test performed on them. Now, these chickens are white leghorns. These white leghorns are specifically bred lab birds, and they are bred in a complete biological isolation from hatch. And they call this specific pathogen free white leghorns. So the eggs hatch, the chicks come out, and they are raised in complete biological isolation from anything. So their immune systems have never encountered anything that might educate it on how to respond to a pathogen. They've specifically been kept away from all pathogens. So they take these birds that have lived their entire lives not being exposed to anything biological, and they inject them directly into their bloodstream with influenza. And, well, they die, because of course they would. If you raised me like that and then shoved influenza into my veins, then I'm not gonna come out too well myself. Hey, even if, like, just me walking around and someone came and injected influenza directly into my body, I'm probably gonna get pretty sick. And I've only had the flu like once in my whole life. So this is a very, very artificial situation to be pulling these numbers from. Now, the study that gave that 100% mortality rate involved 48 of these white leghorns, and all 48 of them died within 48 hours. But, I mean, you probably didn't need to do a scientific study to figure out that was probably going to be the outcome. At this point, I wasn't feeling like I was any closer to an answer to the actual risks in a real-world situation with a heritage breed flock. You know, white leghorns are one of the chickens that have lost the most genetic diversity, and those are what this study was based on with that crazy mortality rate. So I went to try and find stories, actual stories of real backyard chicken keepers who had been affected by bird flu. And I did find some, surprisingly few, but I did find some of them. And in every single instance that I could find, ducks were also being kept along with the chicken flock. I didn't find an instance where only chickens were being kept. They were all mixed situations where there were ducks and chickens together. So that could be a factor. And yeah, these cases weren't great. There were deaths in the flock, and there were quite a few deaths in the flock. But what happened was, before the actual outcome could be determined of exactly how many chickens or ducks were going to die, the authorities would show up and cull the entire flock. So I'm still no closer to knowing what would happen if bird flu came and infected my flock and just ravaged it, right? I don't know what the mortality rate is going to be, because we weren't given the opportunity to find out, because authorities came in and just killed all the birds, which is sort of the standard operating procedure for most places in the world to deal with bird flu. I did find one story about where the authorities weren't called, and quite a few birds did die in that situation. Again, they had ducks as well as chickens, and it seemed like the ducks were dying a bit more than the chickens were. But not all the birds did die in that situation. But this wasn't a very reliable source. It was someone's story on a forum on the internet, and no concrete numbers were given. So, grain of salt on that story. So, I'm still not feeling like I have any actual information still at this point. So I went digging deeper into the scientific literature, and I did find a few studies with a little bit of numbers. So I'm going to tell you about what I found there. So the first thing I found was a study that was based in Egypt from 2013. So not this current round of bird flu, but a previous one. And they had a rate, so for unvaccinated ducks, so unfortunately not chickens, the mortality rate was 28.5% up to 40%. So not great, but not 100%. Then they had numbers for chickens that had been vaccinated once at 22.8 to 30% mortality rate, so still not great, but again, not 100%. And then chickens that had been vaccinated twice with a mortality rate of only 0.14%, which is quite impressive, actually. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, there is not a publicly available vaccine against bird flu, so I can't do that. That's not an option available to me, but interesting to see some actual real-world numbers on mortality rate for chickens or ducks that were actively infected by bird flu. What I gathered from this study was that the vaccine does seem to work quite well, and actual real-world mortality seems to be below 50%, but it's one study in one country from 2013. Then I finally found something interesting. Someone finally decided, hey, I wonder if there's been general exposure in backyard flocks and if we can find antibodies present in the flocks. So I'm like, oh my gosh, thank goodness, finally some numbers. And there are some numbers. So a study from 2011, so again, not from this latest round of bird flu, but from bird flu. So Maryland 2011, they found that 23% of the flocks that they surveyed did have antibodies, which is called seroprevalence against bird flu. So that's pretty good. However, it was only from 39 flocks and a total of 262 chickens. So, I mean, not a very big sample size, but at least there were some numbers. So that means that those flocks had been exposed and had recovered and had antibodies present in their body, indicating that, hey, they met bird flu and they're still all good. The next one I found was from France from 2016, and they found that 11.4% of flocks had antibodies present, but they only looked at 70 flocks. So again, very small sample sizes. The final one that I found was from Pakistan from 2009, and they found that 6.9% of flocks had antibodies to bird flu. That's from a total of only 210 samples, so 210 individual birds. So all of these studies are from very, very small sample sizes, so not a heck of a lot can be conjectured from that, but it's all pointing to the fact that if your flock gets bird flu, it's not a dramatic, terrible thing in every single case. And the thing about statistics and percentages when we're looking at this is that it can't tell you very much about what is individually going to happen for you. In one instance, someone might lose all of their birds to bird flu, and in another instance, someone might lose none of their birds, and that would shake out as a 50% mortality rate. So there's just no way to know specifically what's going to happen in an individual case, but at least I'm finally starting to find some actual numbers, even if they're not that great in terms of the information that you can use to base real-world decision-making on. So now we arrive at looking at the response to bird flu, which in the Northern Hemisphere has been to just cull entire flocks if they have become infected with bird flu. Now, the issue with culling is that it leaves no room for natural selection. So there is no dance between the living organism and the virus where they can respond to each other. It's just, okay, these birds are infected, we're going to kill the entire flock. Now, I can understand this to a certain extent in backyard flocks, even though it's fairly horrific, but you're trying to contain the spread. So I understand the logic from that perspective, and with birds that are open to the environment. Where I don't understand the logic of blanket culls is in commercial sheds, where essentially the birds are already isolated. And if bird flu is so terrible with such a high mortality rate of 100%, why not just close the doors and walk away for 48 hours? And apparently, all of your birds are going to be dead, whether you've culled or not. So I'm a little bit like, well, I'm not seeing the logic here. But it seems like if a chicken shed gets bird flu, they come in and they cull the entire thing as fast as possible within 48 hours. But we're told that bird flu is going to kill everything within 48 hours anyway, so I'm just a bit like, I'm not sure. But culling is not allowing for any sort of survivors to move forward and have the genetics to fight bird flu in the future. So I have issues with culling as a strategy. And I have issues with the methods used to cull flocks, especially in the commercial situation. I'm not going to get into that because it's horrific, but it is not ethically sound in most cases. And I have a problem with that. And then I'm not surprised if bird flu is just roaming through commercial chicken sheds, because a shed with tens of thousands of chickens in it is the perfect environment for a pathogen like bird flu just to sort of spread like wildfire. They're kind of the same as like the slums of London in the mid-19th century. So I'm not surprised that there is an issue. In terms of the New Zealand response to this, whether we're going to cull or not cull, I'm not sure what's going to happen yet. In a backyard situation, we just don't have the infrastructure or the culture where the government could come in and kill all your birds, whether you wanted them to or not. So from a backyard perspective, that's not going to happen here. And at a commercial level, the government has signaled that there's going to be no compensation and it's going to be up to the farmers to deal with it. Maybe they will choose to cull, but without compensation, there's really no compulsion to make them do that. So it's sort of a wait and see what's going to happen in the New Zealand context. Okay, so after I have done this big journey of discovery, what am I going to do to protect my flock from bird flu? Well, not a whole lot, because there's not a whole lot I can realistically do. But I am going to keep focusing on all the things I already do, and that is trying to keep my chickens as healthy as possible so their immune systems have the best chance of fighting off any illness that they might be exposed to. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to stay on top of my parasite management, and when I do parasite management for my chickens, the wild birds get in on the process, so they get a benefit of parasite management as well. So hopefully the wild birds will also be healthier around my chicken flock. So that's really all I can do. Focus on keeping my chickens as healthy as possible with the best food, the best environment, and making sure they've got those micronutrients in their diet to best support them to weather any storm. And I'm going to try not to worry too much about it, because ultimately it is out of my hands to a large extent, and there isn't good numbers on what might actually happen, but it doesn't seem like if my flock gets bird flu that they're all going to die. It doesn't seem like that's what the numbers support. Hopefully it doesn't happen to me. And hopefully, if it does happen, my flock sees it through with minimal losses. We know shockingly little about avian influenza in real-world conditions, and that is something that must be addressed, and I feel like addressed under urgency, before we're circulating inaccurate and hysterical messages online, in the media, and even by our government authorities.